Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the CGSP Roundtable, where I'm joined by Managing Editor Cobus van Staden in Cape Town, South Africa, and of course, our Africa editor, Géraud, joining us from the beautiful island of Mauritius. A very good afternoon to both of you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you, Eric.
It's been a while since we've done a roundtable, so we have made a commitment at CGSP that starting next year, we're going to be better about doing this every week. And we're also going to be doing a lot more of our own videos every week. So I'm going to do a segment. We've got Njenga, our climate editor based in Nairobi, who's going to do a segment. You'll get a kick out of this, guys. Njenga on the street, where he's going to go up to Kenyans and do man on the street interviews to ask them about different topics related to the Chinese. So what do you think of Chinese e-commerce, cheap Chinese goods, Chinese debt? So we're going to get a man on the street point of view. So I think that'll be a lot of fun. And Géraud, he's got his great segments that he does periodically, but we're going to get him to do it more regularly, and because people have been demanding it for us, so we're going to be doing that. So on the roundtable this week, we're going to look back at some of the top stories of the week. We've got three stories in particular that we're going to dive into. One is about Zambia and an $80 million fiasco that took place there. We're also then going to go down to Sri Lanka to find out what's happening with the latest BRI killer by the United States. That has run into some problems. And then we're going to end in Paraguay, where a Chinese diplomat was expelled because of his remarks on Taiwan. So let us get started very quickly looking at what's going on in Zambia. So here we go. Géraud and Cobus, you guys have been following this story all week. There was this snafu that that ZESCO, the national power company, erroneously paid $80 million to the China Exim Bank. Géraud, you were following the story first, and then Cobus, I'd like to get your take on it. What happened here? I mean, this is kind of weird, because $80 million for a country like Zambia in the straits that it's in right now, financially speaking, is a huge amount of money. How does a mistake like this happen?
It's quite simple, I believe. Simple and complex. It was also kind of revealing of the complexity of everything related to how China set up the loan structure with African countries. So basically, we had there is that escrow account where when you have a loan, I think that we've mentioned that in the past before, that escrow account that China puts with its borrowers, where the money is going to come in for specific infrastructure, and there is a certain amount of money that needs to be maintained in that escrow account coming from the revenue of the infrastructure they're building or something like that. So we have this case of this escrow account between ZESCO and a electrical dam that China has financed and built. So the money was supposed, the revenue of that dam always come into that escrow account. But somehow, we don't know how, but somehow someone in the treasury decided to wire $80 million in that account, as if it was something related to that escrow management.
Is that it can't be as simple? Like some dude on the treasury wire desk just decided to put $80 million into the feed to China?
Yeah, they didn't give us the detail on how that happened, but that's what happened. And then at least they came transparent and say, you know what, this is something happened. We are trying to fix it. Yeah.
Cobus, what's your take on it? What do you know?
As far as I understand, it seemed to have been a timing mix-up because obviously these payments are due to China. These are kind of like regular debt payments that need to be paid. The problem is that the Zambia agreed and they signed an MOU with the heads of their debt reconstruction committee, which is led by China and by France. And so, they signed an MOU of that, but that hasn't been finalized into a final debt agreement. So the payments are only actually supposed to be starting once the final agreement is signed. So, overall, this mistake is just, I think, an example of just how messed up these debt renegotiation processes are. Like I said, Zambia has been stuck in this nightmare since 2020, right? So, and the process is still unresolved. It's super messed up, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I
I mean,
think someone
remember,
was unclear if it was done or not done, if it was still the agreement was signed or not. So all of it just come into that mix to, yes, I'm gonna wire $80 million in the account that was supposed to be.
what does this say? And this is my question in terms of what does this say about a government like Zambia? And I don't want to stretch this across Africa because there's so much diversity in terms of policymaking, regulatory capacity, state capacity. But there are some indications that several African governments, if not more, are struggling with their debt management and struggle with the regulatory processes in terms of managing the debt, and then have struggled previously with the loan negotiations with the Chinese in terms of the complexity and signing up to these things. What does this say, if anything, about that bigger? Is there a bigger problem here?
Cobus, go ahead. I'm gonna jump on that after that.
I think for me the bigger problem is that debt restructuring processes are, that the process itself is really broken, and that it's an indication, I think, of how kind of tied up and snowed under these global South governments are, and that once you are kind of labeled as in default, or once you're in, or labeled as in debt distress, then that essentially puts you in this purgatory that these countries can't escape from. And so you see very similar kind of, it's not only in Africa, you see very similar ongoing kind of negotiation nightmares in Pakistan, kind of with Argentina, obviously, notoriously. So it's this kind of process of how, like, once these, it's an interesting kind of like connection to me of like there's all of this research about how China does all of the support lending, like kind of and frequently off-book support lending, and which has a lot of problems. But the one kind of aspect of that is that it keeps countries from this situation. It keeps them from being from landing in this netherworld of kind of where everything is essentially stuck and they can just never get out because these debt reconstruction processes are so messed up.
Me, I'm gonna go a bit on the sideline. I believe that it's much more an internal problem than anything else, beyond the structural problem of how debt restructuring is happening and all the processes and how it's going to be complex and even sometimes difficult to understand by decision makers themselves in host countries. The reality is you just don't wire $80 million like out of the blue like that. I mean,
that's
come
right.
on.
There's an oversight issue and a management problem. At a minimum, there's a management issue that this reveals a problem that checks and balances aren't being done right there.
Because it goes by Ministry of Finance, the Treasury, and the central bank. You have at least 3 entities that has to green light the kind of payment you're gonna make on that account. So you want to tell me that all 3 of them somehow had an oversight into like 80 million, are we supposed to pay that, given that the finance ministry is the lead person into those debt restructuring and everything? So I do believe that it's much more an internal problem. In this case, it's much more an internal problem related to how finance work. Maybe there was that, of course, there was that background of like the idea that we are good to go, we are good to make the payment. You also have the fact that escrow account is regularly filled. There's money coming there regularly. So I believe for me it's a snafu, like a minor snafu, but really that reveals there was a lack of oversight for many of for internal Zambia internal issue. But does it speak to a larger issues? I don't know. I cannot say for sure. I know I can speak for my country where we have our own financial problem where for the 2023 years we don't know how to close our account because $1.3 billion have been spent without any documentation. So that just tells you the kind of
your country, by the way, for those who are not familiar, is the Democratic Republic of Congo, which again, when we talk about state capacity, that really becomes a real issue in a place like the DRC.
Exactly.
And governance and transparency and corruption being an issue there. No indication that we can see from the reporting, at least, and from what we've heard, is that corruption was involved in this. That doesn't seem to be what the problem is here.
Yeah.
No, okay.
It was basically a mistake, just a mistake, a rerouting mistake within the Zambian finance authorities. Yeah.
So on this debt issue, it got me to think back to a couple of other anecdotes in the history of China-Africa debt relations. So, Cobus, I don't know if you remember, but 4 or 5 years ago, if maybe even longer, there was a story where the Chinese were getting very frustrated with the Zimbabwean government and their inability to effectively fill out the forms and manage through the Exim Bank loan process. Now, that sounds simple. These are highly technical, very complicated processes to go through. The U.S. has similarly complex processes. Anybody who's managed a USAID grant knows exactly what I'm talking about. But the Chinese got so frustrated that they actually flew over 10 or 15, I don't remember the precise number, of Zimbabwean officials to train them on how to actually work through the Chinese bureaucracy in order to effectively engage the system. So it's funny because on the one hand, people may think, well, this benefits China in some way. It really doesn't, because when they can't communicate effectively, when mistakes like this are being made, it adds to the concerns and the doubts that maybe people in China have about lending to African countries. This is, and already we have an issue right now that many people in the China Exim Bank and the Ministry of Finance in China are not that keen on Africa today for big loans.
Exactly.
I am pretty sure that the reaction in Beijing on this was, oh, jeez.
Exactly.
Okay. Really? I mean, it's just, and the reason why is the headache. These guys have a lot in their portfolio, and when something like this happens, it just delays and complicates. And now all of a sudden, there's going to be a whole negotiation to get the 80 million back or to credit the 80 million to different. That if you mispaid a vendor for something, trying to get that back or trying to settle that would take months, right?
Can you imagine?
I mean, if you paid your water bill, too much one month, that's not an easy thing to solve. And I'm not trying to reduce this in any way. So I want to bring us back 3 years ago. And this is, I don't know why I thought of this, but I want a reaction to this. This is from 3 years ago. This is a parliamentary oversight committee in Uganda that was interrogating the finance minister on the $200 million loan for the upgrade of the Entebbe airport. And I want you to listen to both the parliamentarians and then the finance minister.
In the agreement, an escrow account was created in Stanbic Bank as a holding account and a guarantee that Uganda will pay back the loan. Much as Uganda so far deposited 4.9 billion, the rights on this account are entirely in the control of the Exim Bank of China. Finance Minister Matia Kasaija has admitted to the mistakes made during the negotiations.
We saw that one to be the cheapest alternative, and we jumped on it. I could apologize that we should have not, shouldn't have accepted some of the clauses, but as I told you, the price is either to take it or leave it.
What happens to Uganda Civil Aviation Authority and the Ugandan airport if we failed to pay this money? What would happen?
Debt trap, by the way.
No. Me, I don't think it's at risk. As I said, if in the unlikely event CAA were to fail to generate sufficient revenue to service the loan, then the central government will step in.
Okay, so this goes on. And one of the things that the finance minister said, which I thought was very interesting, was, and if you looked at the whole testimony, they said, why did you sign this loan? And he said, we didn't understand parts of the contract. And now this was 3 years ago. A lot has changed. But you see so much of the misinformation, the disinformation related to the debt trap that was there that parliamentarians were conveying in that. And at the same time, the finance minister saying we shouldn't have signed some of those clauses. And then later the finance minister saying we didn't understand parts of the contract. And again, that goes back to this question of capacity. And I don't want to stretch this across the entire continent because we know that there's some excellent research being done by Folashade Sule at Oxford University and others who demonstrate that there is a wide diversity of competency in negotiating with the Chinese in Africa, sometimes even within a single country. She's found in her research that the competency, and that shouldn't be a surprise, in probably every region, there is this kind of discrepancy between some who know how to do it and some who don't. When you see this pattern, though, over the years of the difficulties that some African governments have having in terms of negotiating the loans and now managing the debt, Géraud, what comes to mind when you hear all this?
complexity, basically. And this is the part where, for me, I do believe that it's important to remove any kind of ideology behind how we perceive, how we read into the way China is engaging with African countries when it comes to those loans. We don't always measure how much there was either ignorance or overestimation on what was the state capacity of each other and how we should be relating to on those issues. And this is the part where the Chinese made a lot of mistakes into negotiating those loans and into putting in place structure to make sure that African countries are going to pay back. The African country also made a lot of mistakes also into trying to understand and realize that many of them did not just have the capacity to understand those complexities. As you say, we don't want to stretch it across board, but the reality is when we notice some common complaint coming from different parts of the country and from different part of the country on different countries, you realize that there is a certain level of a structural problem into understanding how China approaches those loans. And I think we're going to see that even more. And that's why, for example, the debt shock narrative was able to keep on spreading, because some countries did not understand if they were into a debt shock narrative or not. And they had to wait for Boston University research and Deborah making those research and put, no, we are not in that situation. We are not in that case. And even in the case of Uganda, you realize that the minister is not confident enough to be able to say, no, we are not in that situation. And actually the data are there to prove that you are not in that situation. But somehow he was not so comfortable to do that.
But also, Cobus, what the finance minister said also caught my attention, where it's a take it or leave it. And I think that's the way that a lot of African negotiators approach these Chinese deals. Now, I don't know, you and I obviously were not in the room, but there's this sense of, why did African governments agree to all of these terms? Why do African governments agree to the secrecy terms, even though they go against their own procurement laws and their own constitutions? Why do they agree to arbitration only in Beijing? And the finance minister alluded to the fact that, well, if we don't agree, it's take it or leave it, the Chinese walk away. And I guess my reaction is, if that's the case, sometimes it's okay to walk away. If, you know, it takes two to negotiate, but you got to push back a little bit. And remember that the Chinese, they have something to gain out of these deals as well. So if you walk away, they're losing too. But I get a little bit frustrated that there's this sense of, well, we had to agree to these terms or else. Well, no, you didn't have to agree to those terms. Go ahead.
I mean, I share that frustration, but at the same time, I think what it also reflects is a certain reality, particularly in the African infrastructure spaces, and especially in the kind of early 2010s, when a lot of these very problematic deals were made, is that it was a space where the World Bank, the traditional Western bilateral lenders, no one was funding infrastructure. So there was this kind of situation where these countries were facing this massive infrastructure gap. China was largely the only one willing to do anything about it. So the governments hadn't developed a kind of like internal capacity with in-house lawyers and stuff to deal with these contracts, because there were no contracts to deal with, like of these kinds, until the Chinese stepped in. And then the Chinese, obviously, China always, difficult to understand, even for people who are really interested in China. And also, kind of like a whole kind of unfamiliar kind of like deals. And then on top of that, the deals were frequently shaped by the contractors and government officials, rather than the governments weren't the author of the deal, right? The deal was frequently pre-made and then brought to them for approval. So in that sense, I think it all reflects a particular kind of moment. And now one is like, well, walk away. But at that stage, there were very few other options. And at the same time, also now one is like, get a damn lawyer, Okay,
but is a bad option better than no option? And I'm not suggesting that all these are bad options.
Right? Always facing bad options or no options, right?
Exactly,
those are Africa's two options.
Okay, fair enough.
But there's also internal pressure, because at some time you realize that the one who's sitting on that table has he has made promises. That's true that China also has to gain, but the gain that the one negotiating on Africa is quite immediate, is quite imminent, because he made promises. His legitimacy hinges on that. His ability to govern and to show I'm doing something hinges on his ability to build that airport, to upgrade that railway, to upgrade the highway. So the pressure in the bargaining space is the leverage is not on your side. And this is the part where you are quite weak, because your interlocutor knows your weakness. It knows that you don't have time on your side. It knows that, you know what, I can walk away. You don't have any option. This is the part where you play a kind of game where everybody knows on the table which card do you have on the table. And we all know that in the 28th, 9, 10s, no one would have come, China is not there, the World Bank, the IMF, no one would have run. They know that. So come on. And then they had that feeling that either we take it and we try to manage to make with it, either we leave it. And that was
let me push back a little bit on both of you here. And I agree with what you're saying. But if that was the case in the early 2010s, as you pointed out, as there was no choice, we could make the argument back then that this was all still relatively new. We could make the argument then that people didn't know how the Chinese lent. They didn't know how to work with the China Exim Bank, especially in these large deals. This was all kind of new. We're on the verge of 2025 now. How well do you think that capacity and that knowledge of dealing with the Chinese has improved or not in the 10 years since a lot of these deals were made? I guess that's the ultimate question. Are people learning from their mistakes, or are they continuing to either not improve or worse, actually make the same mistakes again? Cobus, what do you think in terms of the so-called China literacy among people in the finance ministries in places like Zambia, Uganda, and elsewhere?
Well, I can't really talk to how China literate those officials are, but I think African countries are learning some lessons. If you look at, for example, the difference between Kenya's standard gauge railway and then Tanzania's one, somewhat later, there are clearly some lessons learned, and also, negotiators in Benin, for example, have managed to push their agenda. I think, but it's again a different kind of financing landscapes, because these, for a bunch of reasons, including how some of these deals went so badly, a lot of these mega contracts are off the table anyway now. It's small is beautiful era now, so it's a whole
still
different
dead.
set of skills.
Fair enough. It's not $1 billion loan, but still a $20 million loan is a lot of money. Period.
Exactly.
Géraud, what do you see in the DRC, where you know that better than anywhere else?
We don't have in DRC. We don't have really a quote unquote China money and China debt problem. So it's not really part of.
You don't have a China debt problem, but you're still doing a lot of negotiations on mining deals, on infrastructure deals, on lot. It's not on loans, but how do you think the competency of negotiating with the Chinese and the DRC is interesting because companies like CMOC, CNMC, Zijin have been there for a long time. So they've gotten really sophisticated. So it's not, both sides we have to look at.
I think business deals are much more complex to negotiate because you don't only have the facts on the paper that matters. You also have the context, the relationship with people, the ins and outs, the unsaid and then the spoken agreement, the unspoken things, quote unquote, the way of doing business in a certain country that comes into play. So when you look at, for example, how those companies have managed to negotiate the mining contract during the 2023 and 2022, you can assume that, yes, they've not learned, but they've strengthened their position into knowing stakeholders and the incentive of the stakeholders in DRC, how to manage with them, how to work with them, how to get things done, how to get things moving. It doesn't mean on the DRC side, when you speak with different people, they can tell you, we also had cards to play, but other factors came in that did not just allow us to move forward. This is the part where your own weaknesses can play against you, and most of the time they do play against you in those negotiations with Chinese, because let's also face it, you also have some questionable characters in those Chinese companies that are there. You also have some very people that you can really know, you can say that they're not really ethically driven in their negotiation. They can really want to play in those weaknesses and they really take advantage of that. So this is also the reality that you have to take into account. But for me, on the overall picture, I do believe that Chinese are learning faster and more than Africans for one simple reason: the small and smart is beautiful. This is, for me, the signature move that China says, I've learned from my mistake.
That's right.
And one of the signs that Africans are not learning is the fact that Kenya is still waiting for $1 billion for SGR. This is the fact that how can you still ask for something like that?
Well, they want it as a PPP, to be fair, which I think is ridiculous too, because there's not enough business to generate $1 billion of revenue. I mean, the population density and the cargo density just isn't there.
But even the PPP, when we saw the PPP, it was a Chinese offer. We saw that Chinese started with the PPP offer a solution to allow them to still be present there while mitigating the risk into engaging those large projects.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
from that regard, you realize that, yes, Africans are learning, but we are not learning as fast as we should have been learning now to be able to put on the table propositions that we do need for financing, that we do need in a way that matches our reality and the complexity of the international financing system that we are moving in now.
And let's not forget that China knowledge among young Africans in particular is not a scarce resource. Every year, tens of thousands of African students from across the continent are back in China now after the pandemic, once again, studying at major Chinese universities, learning to speak Chinese, getting advanced degrees. And Géraud, this is a topic you've followed very closely over the years, that when they come back home to their various African countries, they are not welcome in many companies and government. And as a result, that China capacity and that China knowledge, that China literacy is not taken advantage of to its fullest extent. That in many ways is the most unfortunate part of all this. Okay, let's move on to our next topic. And Géraud, it's been an interesting week when we talk about the U.S. effort to challenge the Belt and Road Initiative. And this was the focus a lot last week. You wrote a column while you were on the road in Belgium at various conferences during the time which U.S. President or outgoing U.S. President Joe Biden was in Angola talking up the Libido corridor. Cobus and I did a media review podcast, which I thought was excellent. Cobus, we didn't get as much reaction from that as I thought we were going to get. I thought we were going to get all sorts of kind of like, I don't know. I thought it was one of our best shows, and yet it was pretty quiet. And we were calling out kind of the Western media narratives on some of these things. But a big theme that came out of Biden's visit was this Libido corridor is going to take on the Chinese in Africa. Finally, the U.S. is confronting the Chinese on the Belt and Road Initiative, and they're pushing back. Géraud, you wrote this article for us. You know, I think you wrote it on the plane, and your head was filled after doing all these interviews about Angola and the Biden trip, that at the end of the day, this Libido corridor is not really an American project. Before we get on to Sri Lanka, maybe talk a little bit about why your views were so different than the narratives that we saw on the BBC, on France 24, on any number, CNN, on any number of US and European media that had a very different take than you did.
For the simple reason, I do believe, for me, my view was, I had a problem with the views of those big media for one simple reason. They were depriving Angola of any form of agency in this situation, in this deal. Because this deal, the way it's presented now, the way it's portrayed now, it's portrayed that it was a US initiative. It was not a US initiative. It was a business deal, a commercial agreement that Angola opened a bid, and we had Chinese companies there. And we also had Trafigura, the consortium that ended up winning that. And later on, they won that. But when the DFC came, because of the DFC was willing to put money on the table to support that, 250 million, they put the money on the table. And then they say, you know what, they have the opportunity to add other projects, as Cobus yesterday was saying when you were talking about in the podcast. He was saying the bells and whistle around the Benguela Railway project, adding solar power, agriculture, and everything. But at the end, it was really a Benguela Railway project, and it's not a US project. The US came and piggybacked on it, and the way they're shaping and the way they're presenting it, they're really presenting it as, Angola chose us. Angola came for us. We had to push hard to make Angola choose for us. They did not do that. It was not, they were not at the initiative of that. And this is, I think, was really disturbing to me, because at the end, it just makes Angola looks like a simple pawn. You know what? Choose us, and you're gonna, which is not the case. Angola made a sovereign decision to say, you know what, I'm gonna diversify my portfolio. And and this is the case, if tomorrow Trump comes and say, you know what, DFC, we're gonna cut off those Benguela. You know what, the Lobito corridor that project will keep on going on because it's economically viable, and the consortium will find other financier just to keep on funding the project. This is for me what was the problem.
Let's not forget that, and you've pointed this out, that Chinese cobalt and copper can easily go on the Lobito corridor. Let's also not forget that the locomotives that would pull that copper will be Chinese locomotives with GE engines.
From China. Exactly.
And let's not forget the last point, that Moto Engel, who is refurbishing it, doing the construction, that's the Portuguese construction conglomerate, is somewhere close to 40% owned 40%. By a Chinese state construction company. Yeah. So if this is the American effort to counteract the Belt and Road in Africa, Cobus, it feels a little bit odd to me that this would be the place that they would do it and how they would do it. Now, again, when we talk to insiders, and we've all talked to insiders, they will tell you, guys, this really isn't about China. But when you talk to outsiders, when they talk publicly, particularly with Congress on their minds, it's always about China, 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 China. And you heard this because U.S. government officials were doing background briefings throughout the Biden visit talking about China. But Cobus, as you pointed out, the difference between the Republicans and the Democrats is that the Republicans say the word China and the Democrats don't. They use unsustainable debts. They use imported labor, low quality infrastructure, wink, wink, nod, nod, wink, wink, nod, nod. And so what ended up happening was the media narrative emerged as China. So Cobus, what's your take?
Well, it's interesting kind of contrast, because yesterday in a podcast interview, Géraud and I were speaking with Cameron Hudson, who's a prominent analyst in of Africa issues in DC. And he was actually kind of saying almost the opposite in the sense that he was saying that, yes, in public, people avoid the mention of China at all. But in private, a lot of these officials are like fully, yes, we managed to kind of get Angola out of China's orbit, in which case, and if they are saying that, my response is, well, good luck with that, because it's like, that's not the situation. But it has become this, it's become part of, I think, it's become part of both a dynamic of an interaction between the US government and the Western press, right? Kind of where the US government is sending dog whistles around China, kind of throughout the Biden administration. The Western press picked up on those dog whistles and then made them explicit. Right.
Exactly.
So the U.S. government gets its anti-China narrative without having to commit to it in public, because the press is doing that work for it. And in the process, what happens is, what happens is that a complex player like Angola, who really is on par with Vietnam in terms of tricksiness and playing all sides against each other, now gets kind of like flattened to our BFF, which is really funny.
Exactly, which is, I think, it's really misrepresenting and misleading. And it was really upsetting to me because, as I said, I think I made it clear in the column, the way the media are portraying it, like, no. I said, no, guys, I'm sorry. This is sovereignty expressing itself. Angola says, you know what? We're going to diversify our portfolio. What even people don't know is, like, at the beginning, the Chinese won the concession of the Lobito port on the Atlantic Ocean. It's because the Chinese finally gave up on that we had now AGL coming on that. But this just to show you that Angola was fully open to have the railway with Western companies and the port with Chinese company, and they were completely fine with that to begin with. So when you come and say it was a US project, it's not. It was not, and it was not.
Yeah, and what I like to do is I always like to remind my American friends, my compatriots, that when they talk about how Angola is kind of coming on their side, and you hear this a lot from the likes of Tibor Nagy, of Peter Pham, these are these guys who are very kind of hawkish on China and Africa, and they hold up Angola as a case study for how they can lure someone to, I say, their side. They overlook conveniently the fact that João Lourenço, the president, was in Shandong province this year and brought an entire plane load of business leaders to China's northeastern Shandong province, met with Xi Jinping in Beijing, and there was no indication whatsoever that there's any distance ideologically, financially, or otherwise between Lourenço and the Chinese. Cobus, to your point, what Lourenço is doing is what any middle power government today is doing, which is trying to leverage both sides in all of this and resisting the binary pull. But yet these details of this trip back in March are conveniently overlooked, or maybe they didn't ever know about it. but it is interesting to so that there's a giant memory hole there.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, so the, kind of when African kind of like focused people talk about like the flattening of African agency, this is a good example. Because, like not only is Lorenzo close to China, not only did he travel there, he managed to get the Chinese to reschedule Angola's loans, which is essentially
Huge amounts
impossible.
of loans.
Like,
No.
Kind of,
Yeah,
it's like every other African country with debt to China has tried to do that, and no one has succeeded.
But also remember, here's the interesting thing. There's a little wrinkle in all of this. The China Exim Bank loans tend to be the concessional loans. The China Development Bank loans tend to be the more market-based loans. They tend to be much stricter on the China Development Bank loans because they're commercial-based loans. They got the CDB to restructure their debt. That's quite an accomplishment. And again, just for those of you who may be watching and not familiar with the important outsized role that Angola plays in this debt issue that we talked about in Zambia in the first part of the show, is a third of all Chinese lending to Africa in the period from about 2000 to 2023 went to Angola, about $50 billion. So it's a huge outsized role for all of this. And so, Cobus, you're absolutely right that their ability to negotiate that is a real accomplishment. But I just really want to push back on the perception that somehow the Angolans are further aligning themselves with the Americans, because again, the evidence just doesn't support that. Géraud?
Yeah, it's diversification. That was going to be my last word. I think they're missing the point and they're misreading when African countries say, I want to diversify. They're listening, they're hearing, I hate China, I want to move away from China. No, I don't hate China. I don't want to move away from China. I just want to have more options on my table.
And that's what you hear in your country, in the DRC. It's not that they want to get rid of Chinese mining companies. It's just that they feel having so much dependence on Chinese mining companies isn't good business.
Exactly, and you have that. It reminds me of a story I read a few weeks ago where the DRC mining companies pitched the same project to the US to US and Western companies, and also pitched the same project during the forecast to Chinese mining companies. Just to tell you that you're just gonna pitch to anybody who's willing to put money on the table, and for us it's just good business. That's it.
Well, it makes sense. Okay, so let's kind of move on. And that was a very long setup for. A major setback for this effort by the United States to counteract the Belt and Road Initiative. And if you spend any amount of time in Washington, this is what you hear a lot, that they want to really challenge the Belt and Road. Well, the Indian conglomerate Adani Group is, under an investigation for corruption. And that has now just unraveled a lot of India's ability to mount a challenge to the Belt and Road, but also particularly in Sri Lanka, where the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation had lined up a $553 million loan that the Adani Group would use to build or refurbish the port of Colombo. Cobus, this is a topic you covered this week. And again, this is in many ways a huge setback for the Americans, because part of their strategy was, well, we don't have the construction companies. We don't have the skills and the talent to be able to do this kind of infrastructure. But in our network of partner countries, there are groups like the Adani Group that can do it for us. And here we go. It didn't work out. And so now Adani's not done building this port, just not going to involve the DFC. Cobus, tell us a little bit more about what happened.
So the way I understand this, and it's a kind of a complicated story, but so this is for a project for a terminal, a port terminal, in a kind of a deep sea kind of side of Colombo port, which is one of the world's busiest ports, and so the Sri Lankans made a deal with the Adani Group to build this terminal, and this building is happening. Like it's supposed to, the terminal is supposed to be commissioned in early next year. So that's already happening. And the DFC was Adani then stepped into talks with the DFC for around $550 million loan for as I understand it, the final part kind of this construction. Then Adani got hit by all of these indictments in US courts around allegations of possible corruption around a different project which related to solar power. And then but the talks with the DFC were still ongoing. The DFC they've agreed to a loan agreement in 2023, but they hadn't finalized the formal agreement. And so then Adani let the DFC know that they will use Adani Group internal funds to finish the project, and they're withdrawing from the talks on the loan. Essentially the DFC was gonna, through the loan, was gonna have a stake in this Colombo port, and it lost that stake. Keep in mind that China Merchants Port Holdings, huge ports company, owns huge amounts of Colombo port, and they also own a very large stake in Hambantota port on the other side of Sri Lanka.
So yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, let me just I want to give you a view from Washington on this. It's interesting. This is this is a very funny video. Director of South Asia Institute at the Wilson Center, Michael Kugelman, he was on ANI TV. I just think that he looks like he's in a hostage video right there. I mean, so it's just, I mean, it doesn't look like a normal think tank interview, but he was speaking on Indian media about the collapse and the setback for the Americans. Let's take a listen.
This was, I would argue, a blow to the U.S. The fact that Adani has decided not to receive this funding. Yeah, I think that the U.S. had looked at this arrangement with Adani in Sri Lanka as a major opportunity and really as a major achievement when it comes to countering China. You look at what China has been able to do around the Indo-Pacific in terms of its infrastructure investments. The U.S. Indo-Pacific policy is very much about countering China by providing alternatives to the countries of the Indo-Pacific. And essentially the goal of the Indo-Pacific policy is to provide what the U.S. would describe as better alternatives, better options for the countries of the Indo-Pacific. And I think that the U.S. was hoping that working with Adani in Sri Lanka to build this infrastructure, this port infrastructure project, that this could be a very powerful way of pushing back against China. And my sense is that U.S. officials had looked at this deal with Adani in Sri Lanka as really a signature example of how the U.S. has the capacity to counter China and to beat China at its own game. And now with this deal apparently not going forward, I do think that this does represent a strategic blow of sorts to the U.S.
So, Géraud, I mean, there it is. And this at the time of the signing, this is what he was talking about. There was a lot of excitement that we have figured it out. This is how we're going to do it. We're going to get this network of partner countries, network of partner companies like Adani, and this is what we're going to do. At the end of the day, though, I just don't think that the U.S. has the operating system to be able to do an effective challenge of China's Belt and Road. Our system of government is not set up the same way. It's not because we don't have the money. We've had plenty of money. Our friend Jude Moore, who is at the Center for Global Development, he made this very interesting point a couple of years ago. When you hear the argument in Washington that says we can't go dollar for dollar with the Chinese on the Belt and Road, that's actually not true, because the global war on terror, we spent trillions of dollars. We could have done 4 or 5 Belt and Roads for the cost of what the global war on terror cost the Americans. It's not that there is not enough money. It's that the Americans just don't choose to allocate it.
They could fully have solved global warming with
any number of things.
The money they spent on those wars.
Just Afghanistan alone was more than $1 trillion. That could have been, Afghanistan alone could have been a real challenge to the Belt and Road. But by trying to do it on the cheap this way, without your own people, with a very flimsy network, what you end up getting into is what Géraud pointed out, is you end up putting lipstick on the pig. And what that means is that you end up taking the libido corridor, which is not really an American issue, is not really an American project, is not really going to be a challenge to the Belt and Road, and you call it the Belt and Road challenger and the killer. Or you do a deal with Adani. And by the way, the irony that there's a corruption scandal going on here is just maddening, because, one thing that the Americans talk about the Belt and Road is it's just laden with corruption. So, I mean, there's a little bit of irony here that corruption is the problem, and But Géraud, let's hear your take.
I was really trying to understand how this Adani project would have challenged the Belt and Road Initiative, because when you look at the DFC role here, the DFC is just providing financing to Adani Group, and the loan is to Adani Group. Adani has to pay back. So when even Adani is going to build that, Adani has no incentive to block any Chinese infrastructure project or any poor Chinese vessel to use that. That's the fact. One element. And second, since it's the case, you're like, what we don't see in the Belt and Road, it's not only the financing, it's also the construction company. China gave money to Chinese companies that are building infrastructure in these places. It's a really component of those two things at the same time.
That's right. And not only that, but they'll bring in Chinese cement, Chinese equipment, Chinese. So everything helps China in that respect.
Everything helps China in that respect. So you're just giving money to an infrastructure entrepreneur on a project somewhere, and you say, I'm countering China. I don't understand it, because it could have been any bank. Let's say if it was European Bank of Investment, you would have said that EU is countering the Belt and Road. If it was South Africa, DBSA, if it was any other banks, like, this is the part where it's like, I'm really trying to understand or to grasp the China countering China narrative by DFC providing loans to a company that's winning a project somewhere in the global south.
And it brings up the same issue with the Lobito corridor of how Chinese mining companies would use the corridor to transit. One would assume that if the Port of Colombo is operational, that I don't think the Sri Lankans would turn away a Chinese ship that's going to pay for a docking fee, because they need to repay the loans.
Yeah,
so again, to your point, I'm not 100% sure how this undermines the Chinese when, and I could imagine the reaction in Beijing is like, so there's new logistics capability in Sri Lanka, and that's a bad thing. I mean, because you're not going to see a country like Sri Lanka. This will not happen. Deny access to a Chinese ship at a port. It won't happen.
Exactly.
I mean, it also seems to me like a kind of a, like on broad terms, it seems kind of like a symptom of a larger problem in Washington, which is that they tend to flatten the kind of their current geopolitical moment into this bipolar horse race between them and China, whereas the real situation is that it's the rise of China wasn't the rise of this kind of second superpower that is trying to replace the US. The rise of China is part of the rise of several powers, like it's multipolarism. And so it leads to like having this bipolar horse race kind of frame through which they see everything, particularly in this very tunnel vision kind of way. It tends to lead to this kind of magical thinking, right? It tends to lead to the magical thinking that Angola, for example, is now in our orbit. And I mean, if you talk about tricksiness and playing all sides, India is the king of that, right? So, so in the same week that we're talking about this situation, it came out that India is planning to spend like billions of dollars on a new radar system from Russia. Right, in between being like America's best friend and like countering, kind of the axis of whatever, like India.
Yeah, we might have lost Cobus there, but
Cobus for a moment,
he's freezing up there. But yeah, and let's not forget, of course, the famous Modi hug. That
the bear hug with Putin. Yeah, Cobus, you're back, and
you're back. No, we're just bringing up to your point this the famous. Modi hug that came on. I mean, this was not that long ago. This was July. And so the Americans are delusional again if they think that Modi and the Indians are going to somehow be in their corner. This is not a guy who's going to be in the American corner. Now, he's going to play on the American side of the fence every once in a while, to be sure, no doubt. And he's a useful club against the Chinese selectively. Not all the time, but I think, Cobus, to your point before you broke up and we lost you there, Indians are notoriously unreliable for being aligned with one side or the other. And that's probably, again, part of this dynamic as well.
National interest is their dominant agenda, so they make that work with whoever. And I mean, and all of these other countries are also like that. Vietnam is like it. Indonesia is like that. South Africa is like that, small as it is.
Angola is like that. Cote d'Ivoire
all of them are. All of them are.
And yet in Washington, the logic of being with us, quote unquote, is so powerful, that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
so they don't understand that, you can be with everybody. Like, I'm choosing who I'm gonna be with, and this is the part where they kind of lost. There is a cognitive dissonance where they just don't get it. I mean, how is that happening? How that situation is happening on the ground with us?
It was funny because I heard, this is hearsay, so I will not use names, but the head of a very prominent U.S. Congress-backed think tank that has 3 initials in it, or 3 letters in it, opposite of the NED. It's the, so I'm kind of painting it generally, but apparently the president, who we've had sound bites on our show, declared at a local university here when he was here a few weeks ago that very confidently that Vietnam's on our side against China. And everybody in the room was like, really? They were very excited that Vietnam is going to be, aligned with America, and because they pick up on certain aspects of the rhetoric that are very critical of China, but yet they don't read the other 2 or 3 pages that have the but also you have to see. And that's the problem. And that's where you kind of get misled if you're not really well versed in these issues.
And they also, so I mean, like we're now shouting at the US all the time, but like they, kind of one problem I think that it faces is that the US system tends to be quite ahistorical, right? So it tends to be difficult for them to take into account the role these countries' history plays in current decisions. And even like as all of this stuff was happening, what was also happening in Vietnam this week was a formal and very kind of like dignified ceremony between the Vietnamese government and veteran organizations in China, military veteran organizations, to honor Chinese personnel who were involved in the original Vietnamese independence war against France, right? Like, so, like that history continues parallel.
Exactly.
Kind of that like the fact that the Chinese helped the Vietnamese to fight against France in the 60s is still valued today. It still cements the relationship today. The US and France actually are blind to that, right? Kind of like they tend to not kind of like take that into account at all, and yet it is at play in all of these relationships. It's very deeply at play in Angola specifically.
Yeah, I mean, let's not forget that it was in our lifetime, Cobus, I don't know about Géraud, but certainly in our lifetime that the Ronald Reagan government was and your apartheid government were supporting anti-communist forces in Angola and committed horrific war crimes. I mean, and that is not lost on people.
Still landmines in the ground in Angola from that conflict.
Yes. I mean, and again, here in Southeast Asia, we are still feeling the effects of the conflicts. And so again, to your point on a historical, but Cameron Hudson, in your discussion that you guys had, which by the way, we'll be releasing that show. That show is already out. So exactly. If you want to listen to the interview that Géraud and Cobus did with Cameron Hudson, download it on our podcast, or you can watch it right here on YouTube as well. But he did say, I mean, and this is one of the reasons why we are more critical of the US than we are of China, is because the US gives us a lot of material to work with. The Chinese government is so opaque, so closed, so difficult to access that we just don't have as much to pick apart. So it's not because we're necessarily, biased towards criticizing the U.S. and giving the Chinese a pass on it. It's just a lot more difficult to hit the Chinese on these types of issues. My last point on this, you just take me back to our trip in DC in July, and the feeling that we had when we left there is like, when I see the Adani situation, the Lobito and all of that, the involvement of the UFC and all the narrative around how it counters or it doesn't counter BRI in any way, it just speaks to me to that conclusion regard. Like, we left DC with the feeling that there's no clear understanding of what winning and countering China looked like. That's right.
And because there's no clear understanding, that you have the feeling that everything that seems to have DFC is there, it's countering China. But when you look at the fact, like, how does it counter China in any way? And this is, I think, it speaks to that, the fact that in DC, there's so much emotions around where China is, we have to be there, that there's no clear thinking and clear definings like, okay, what does it look for us for US when we say we are winning in the global south against China? What does it mean? Does it mean that those countries can still have Chinese investment, but at the UN they vote for us? Or does it mean that they're going to vote for us because they have financing coming from us? Or does it mean that we are there, but in the UN they still vote for China? All of that needs to be clear, understand. And when they do that, I think that they're not going to waste energy and resources on things where that really doesn't matter, or get them to get where they want those global South countries to be.
One of the things that you notice when you spend time in DC is that on Capitol Hill, you'll hear one thing about China. Then you go to the White House, you hear something different about China. Then you go to the State Department and to the various executive agencies, you hear a third thing about China. Then you go to the think tanks, they've got different views. And then the academic community and the corporate community also have different views. There is no consensus on how to approach strategy and how to formulate a response. And that's been one of the big challenges that the United States is facing. So we see the NVIDIA case is a great example here. By the way, NVIDIA just opened up a huge investment in Vietnam, unrelated to China in many respects. It's, Vietnam's a promising market for a lot of this technology. But at the same time, NVIDIA came under investigation in China now, and they're really caught in the middle of this great power struggle. NVIDIA spends an enormous amount on lobbying that doesn't necessarily align with a lot of the political thinking. And Géraud, you've made this point over and over and over again, that corporate America's view on China is radically different than that of the policy side. So when Ford and Tesla are doing deals with Zhejiang Huayou Cobalt for nickel supplies in Indonesia, that's running against this idea of creating parallel supply chains. NVIDIA has been wanting to sell more advanced chips into China, but the Americans have restricted that. Now the Chinese are punishing NVIDIA. Very, very messy, but I think it shows you the complexity of what's going on. Let me now just wrap up our last topic, and this was a fun one for me that I want to talk to you about. So Paraguay expelled a Chinese diplomat by the name of Xu Wei. Now this happened last week, and what he did, he came
provoca que nuestro aliado
to Asunción for presumably, ostensibly for a UNESCO meeting. And what he did is he didn't go to the UNESCO meeting. He went to the parliament, and you can see him right there when he's at the parliament building, and decided to hold a press conference in order to berate the Paraguayan government for continuing to recognize Taiwan. And he said, if you turn and drop and abandon Taiwan, you will get all sorts of benefits and all sorts of perks by joining with China. Well, to say the least, the Paraguayan government did not appreciate this at all, and they revoked his visa, and then they gave him 24 hours to leave the country. And this is this is the funniest part. This is really why I wanted to do this. So check this tweet out this is coming from the immigration service of the Paraguayan government. And they posted this. There he is, that Xu Wei at the airport getting the boot. And just to put a little bit of a fine point on, like, you are not welcome in this country, and we're posting your picture up on social media to kick you out of the country. And anybody who thought that Chinese diplomats dress elegantly when they travel, he dresses like the rest of us do when we travel, in nice kind of comfy clothes. So, but Xu Wei was kicked out of Paraguay. Paraguay is one of only 11 countries around the world that continue to recognize Taiwan. And also, this Taiwan issue came up this week as well. Ghana has a new president, a new old president, right, Géraud?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He was president before. Yeah. And
what's so interesting is that the first statement that the new president, the President John Mahama, isn't that his name, right? Mahama. John Mahama. And so, that the first thing that he said was he met with the Tong Defa, who is the Chinese ambassador to Accra. And the first statement that came out in the Ghanaian press, not even in the Chinese press, was that Ghana continues to respect the one China policy. So you can see that the importance for China on pushing this Taiwan issue, this is their issue, their priorities, what they want to do. That is paramount. So here we have Xu Wei getting the boot out of Paraguay.
But
so I just thought that was so interesting.
But it's so out of character, though. I mean, his move is
no,
really
not
so
really.
out
Not
of
on
character.
Taiwan. It's not.
No,
Not on Taiwan. It's not.
No. I mean, when I say out of character, is that a Chinese diplomat going for an event in a country, instead of attending the event, you go to the parliament and go hold a press conference and talk about Taiwan. I'm like, it's so out of character, because usually they're gonna have so many tools they can use. They're gonna use the state media. They're gonna use so many mechanisms to do that. Than for a diplomat, a low-level diplomat, mind you, go and have that bold move and trying. I mean, that I found it really so out of character. It's like, why would you do that? There's no really upset for you doing that anyway.
I was wondering how it would impact on his career, kind of like in China, because like whether, what's the balance between, on the one hand, embarrassing China and on the other hand, or being like kicked out in this kind of very visible way, or demonstrating like super wolf warrior level of like
no. Cobus. Nothing. He didn't go freelance and go rogue and do this. This was planned and orchestrated and choreographed, and there is no. This was not, Xu just deciding on his own to kind of like, I'm not going to go to the UNESCO brunch. I'm going to go down to the Parliament and hold a press conference.
I think then also, were they just like media teams just hanging around the Parliament, or did they? Were they arranged?
No. But that's not unreasonable. Media is at the Parliament all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, in most governments, that there is a standing press corps at the Parliament, and he probably knew this. Listen, my guess is this was choreographed. This was set up. Now, here's what's so interesting.
Okay.
So some people will comment that, well, this is a violation of the internal affairs of another country that China says it will not do. Here we are, a Chinese diplomat in a foreign country speaking on domestic issues. The Chinese don't see it that way because they consider Taiwan to be a domestic affair of theirs. So this is why the Taiwan issue gets a kind of an exception from that interference in internal affairs of other countries.
But the thing is, Paraguay doesn't recognize Taiwan. So basically, China.
No, Paraguay does recognize Taiwan. They don't recognize China.
Yeah, they recognize Taiwan. What I said, so they cannot just go send anybody there. Just go and talk about Taiwan there. And the minimum they can do, we don't have diplomatic relationship with Paraguay. That's it. But sending a diplomat, I mean, I really wonder what was the end game.
I think the end game is to put maximum pressure on Taiwan. Every place, every move they go, they get pressure and they get squeezed. That's the goal.
But
and they want to take it from 11 down to 3.
It's true, but at the same time, it struck me as so clumsy, right? Kind of like it reminded me. Remember that incident a few years ago? I can't remember. It was somewhere in Europe where there was some kind of Taiwan-related event, and then a Chinese official literally ran into the room, grabbed the event brochure, and like tore out pages, kind of like related to Taiwan. It gives that vibe. It's like it's very unhinged.
I know you say that, but this is, and we're going back into the Trump era where a lot of these diplomats are performing for an audience of one. Yeah. They are signaling up to one person so I'm on that wall. I've got the rifle. I've got your back. I'm fighting the fight. You call it clumsy and unhinged, but I have a feeling people inside Zhongnan High, the leadership compound in Beijing, are looking at this guy and going, that's awesome.
Having a Chinese diplomat expelled in terms of
views, on the issue of Taiwan, there's no limit that they'll go to. Listen, they put something like, they did their second largest military exercise around Taiwan this week. This is again what I keep saying about why people are saying Chinese military bases in Middle East and West Africa and South America. Like, no, the focus is on the Western Pacific, on Taiwan, on South China Sea, and these guys are going to the mat. So the Taiwan government and the Taiwan ambassador in Paraguay thanked the Paraguayan government for doing this. But this occupied Paraguayan media last week for a lot. It was a lot of drama, and again, I just got such a hoot out of this picture because I don't think in all the times I've ever seen a diplomat kind of get the send-off that he's gotten like this, because sometimes in diplomacy, you get things happen behind the scenes, like he was escorted out of the country, but this is from the official Paraguayan Immigration Service. And let's see what they said at 12:10 p.m., immigration carried out the expulsion of citizen, by the way, very interesting.
Not diplomats, yeah.
Not diplomat, citizen Xu Wei of Chinese nationality at the international airport. The procedure was carried out in accordance with the provisions of migration law 6984/22, just in case you had any doubts about the legality of them kicking him out. So I thought that was good. Okay, let's wrap this up. I think we're getting past the hour of what we wanted to do. It's always a lot of fun for us to kind of have these conversations. Cobus, we're wrapping up the week. We're going into the new year. Leave folks with a little bit of where we are today in terms of some of the thematics that you've seen this year and what you're looking at next year. And we're going to do a whole year in review show next week. But just kind of, what are you looking at? What's your feeling right now on where we are in terms of US, China in the world, China Global South?
I think we're in, we're really kind of in a moment where everything is up in the air and things will only really start landing in January.
January 20th specifically?
January 20th, yeah, among others, but yes, definitely. Okay. Because I think, I think there's a lot of hot takes at the moment on what the different kind of like Trump approaches will be to Africa, to China and other places. We still have to see how that's going to go, but I think in the process, like, this is also a year where I think China has become a lot more, that's really kind of like stepped back up on the international stage. I think they're a lot more prominent now, I think, than they were a year before. Okay. I think particularly like since the Belt and Road Forum of like October last year, I think, since then they've really been leaning in, I think, to their Global South outreach. So they I think a lot more of a kind of a robust presence than they were over the last few years.
Géraud, what do you think?
For me, it's going to be interesting to look into how a struggling China economically is now going to deal in the Global South and in Africa, especially given a new Trump and against the backdrop of all the chip war, technology war, critical minerals and sanctions and all the export ban that China is responding to what the US and Europe are putting in place. For me, it's going to be how now China is going to adapt to all this environment and how African countries are going to respond to that. And I do believe that this is the moment for African countries to really place their cards smart in a way that they don't get. It's one thing to say we don't want to get caught up. It's another thing to really walk into not to get caught up in those fights. And for me, it's going to be really interesting given China's current situation. And of course, if the situation gets worse in China, we may see another impact on Africa. But if they manage to get things right, given what with the meeting they had last week with Xi Jinping receiving all different banks and DFIs and big financial institutions, reassuring them that China is doing well. But I do believe that we're going to have to look that closely on how China's economic situation is going to impact its engagement with the countries of the Global South.
You set me up just perfectly. I'm going to take a slightly different take than you. I'm becoming increasingly more optimistic about the Chinese economy. I'm not sure it's as in dire straits as many people believe it is. It's still a huge economy. And so when we here in Southeast Asia, a lot of people are talking about an alternative to China +1 strategies. And when you look at Vietnam, which comes up a lot as an alternative, Vietnam is a $420 billion economy. Literally, Elon Musk has almost as much money as this economy. When you add up Vietnam's economic size compared to cities and provinces in China, it comes in at number 18 at the same size as the city of Chongqing. Okay, 1% of Chinese shipping would overwhelm Vietnam's ports, just 1%. Okay, and when you look at the infrastructure in China, and go to Guangdong province, for example, and you go to the port of Shenzhen or you go to the port of Guangzhou, and then you take the highways. These are 16-lane highways that are only populated by trucks that feed into rail networks that feed directly into the factories. You start to appreciate there is no China +1 strategy. There is China. I mean, there's nobody else in the world that has the infrastructure, the logistics, the scale, the ability, and the supply chain networks. I mean, think about just what it takes to build this phone. Géraud, you have to source tons of cobalt from your country to put into this phone, despite what Tim Cook says. There's artisanal cobalt in this Apple phone. Dua Lipa called him on that one, or she asked him about it, and he lied. But think about all the glass, the cobalt, the tantalum, the tin, the metal that has to be brought in manufactured on a short notice, and then shipped out. Vietnam doesn't have the capacity. Cambodia doesn't have the capacity. India doesn't have the capacity. And Americans are smoking or eating gummies on levels that are just absurd if they think that our infrastructure is capable of being able to do that. And if you've traveled to the port of Long Beach or the port of Newark or even the port of Oakland, you recognize they're not even anywhere near the scale of what the Chinese are operating at in terms of infrastructure. So I'm not as down as I used to be on the Chinese economy. I think it's running into some headwinds. It's got a lot of structural problems. It's got an unemployment problem. It's got a demographic problem. There are a lot of problems, but the foundation of a lot there is quite strong. And it may not be growing as fast, but it's still going to be a pretty robust thing. So
I think our Chinese listeners are going to love this comment.
I know. I mean, especially on YouTube, on YouTube,
They're gonna love it.
We have both the China haters and the China and the pro-China folks. They can't figure out. They're like, this white American guy is, one day he's saying this, anti-China stuff that they don't like, and the next day he's saying like China's economy is great. So they're not really quite. And I feel like if we get that kind of mixed messaging on our comments, then we're doing just fine.
It's good. Exactly.
We're doing just fine. Okay, so let's leave our conversation there. Gentlemen, thank you very much. You're going to start seeing a lot more of the three of us and the rest of the CGSP team starting in January. We're doubling down on our YouTube and our video strategy because this is where the conversation's happening, and we always want to go where the conversations are happening. Of course, if you'd like to join us, in what we do in our day jobs, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com. Cobus, Géraud, Johnny, Edwin. We have a team of about 8 people in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East who are doing some fantastic work. And then, of course, Géraud's fantastic work en français at Projet Afrique Chine is available. And I just also want to give a shout out that we are now on Blue Sky and really enjoying the conversation on Blue Sky. By the way, the China watching space has left Twitter. I mean, it's really gone, and it is all on Blue Sky. So I encourage you to join us over on Blue Sky. And yeah, we're still on X, but whatever. I'm not that passionate about X anymore. So it's all about Blue Sky for us and also YouTube as well. So, gentlemen, have a wonderful weekend ahead. We'll see you next week for another edition of the Roundtable. We want to thank everybody on YouTube, LinkedIn, and X for joining us today on this live stream. And then, again, hope to see you soon on the CGSP Roundtable. Bye for now.
Bye, guys.
Bye.